Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, your co-host and the number one fan of the Amazon Labor Union.
I'm Dean Detloff, your other co-host, and I guess I'll be your number two fan of the Amazon Labor Union.
A close second. We're both big fans, but if we did have to judge, I am slightly a bigger fan.
I guess we could be co-number one fans in the same way that we're co-hosts of this podcast.
We could be. I didn't even consider it, but I'm willing to share that title with you.
Oh, that's so kind. Yeah, that's right, folks. It's all about reconciling on this podcast this time around. How's that for
What
a transition? I know.
Incredible work.
Yep. I'm not going to pat myself on the back too much, but I am a little, even though it's Lent. Throughout Lent, we've been talking about all kinds of themes: fasting, charity, temptation, crucifixion. And I got to tell you, we're running out. We're running out of themes. So you can.
If Jesus could get crucified and then come back, I'd really appreciate it because our podcast is running on fumes right now.
Oh,
you gotta get to Holy Week.
Yeah, Easter could not come quicker for this podcast specifically. Can't wait to be done trying to find these themes. But we did find another one, and it's penance. So I hope you're ready for that. Penance is kind of an old-timey word, an old-fashioned word, unless you're Catholic, I guess, and you kind of hear it a lot. But I mean, welcome to the old-fashioned church. But basically, it means hating your own sin and trying to do whatever it takes to atone or reconcile your actions with someone that you've harmed, or trying to, deal with that sin in some interesting ways. And as you could guess, penance has a lot of messed up stuff going on. But we're going to try to see if we can think of some cool liberation, social justice-y ways of interpreting that idea in the Christian tradition, either as a sacrament or otherwise in a kind of more general way.
Yeah, that's right. And as it turns out, it's actually not that hard to do that type of Christian-y, liberation-y sort of reading of penance. It's actually all kind of just there. And I appreciate that. But you do have to think about it a little bit harder. But anyways, like Dean was saying, penance is a type of virtue. That's a fancy word for acting like you should. It's a type of virtue that stems out of like a personal sense of justice. And I'm not just making that up. I'm taking it from the man himself, Thomas Aquinas. That's right, folks. We're talking about everyone's favorite Tom on this show.
The big ox, as they called him. The big, didn't they call him the big stupid ox or something like that?
I think so. I think that's true. Yep. So Thomas Aquinas is one of those really important medieval theologians in the Catholic Church. I mean, I think everyone who is a Christian pays attention to him to some extent. I don't know. Even at my evangelical school, we talked about Thomas Aquinas quite a bit. So there we go. Thomas Aquinas says this about penance. Penance as a virtue resides in the will, since it's a part of the cardinal virtue of justice. It urges the individual to undergo punishment for the sake of repairing the order of justice. When motivated by even an ordinary measure of supernatural charity, it infallibly obtains the forgiveness of venial sins and their temporal punishments. There's a lot going on there, but the important part, at least the part I want to draw attention to, is that penance is something that's connected to justice. And we could read that a few different ways. I mean, there's something very deeply individualistic, or maybe not individualistic. There's something deeply introspective about that type of justice, that your life is all in shambles and like you're a bad person doing bad things and maybe you should stop and you seek some kind of you seek to repair that in your life in sort of like an internal spiritual or like moral ethic kind of way. But also there's another sense in which there's a bigger picture to it, right? There's a base and superstructure vibe to it that when society is out of whack, you can think about penance, you can think about reconciliation, and those types of ideas. So I don't know. I think Aquinas here gives us a little bit of a head start or a push in the right direction when it comes to penance, right? It's not just about punishing ourselves or something for like how bad we are. That's a weird way to think about it, maybe. But Christians love to, I guess. But the thing about penance that I think Aquinas at least kind of gives us, or at least the direction it sets us, is that there's something like deeper there, that you're doing penance because like something is wildly wrong in your life or something. There's some kind of atonement that you need to do or some kind of reconciliation you need to find. I think that applies internally, introspectively, spiritually, but also I think at the larger societal sense too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated idea to parse out, right? Because like as I said a moment ago, there's a lot of ways that this can get really messed up and very
Totally.
toxic, and it's an idea that lives on in lots of other traditions, like in evangelicalism, for instance. There is a lot of this, right? Punishing yourself in order to bring justice to the world is basically basically a textbook recipe for evangelicalism.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it is also politically really toxic, right? The idea that you could try to sort of solve the justice problem by taking it all upon yourself and punishing yourself as a means of redemption. I think anybody who's spent a long time in Christianity has probably had to deal with that sort of toxic idea and all the yucky stuff that comes along with it. So, not here to affirm that piece of it. But I think that it's true, though, that there's something kind of there's something about tying an idea like penance to justice that also makes intuitive sense for me as a person in my world. When I move through a world that is full of injustices, I find that I myself am either contributing to those injustices or am wrapped up in them somehow, or they make me act in ways that I don't like, or I find myself acting in ways that I don't like that kind of reproduce injustices, right? So there's this recognition that sometimes in order to deal with an unjust society, we also have to work on ourselves. And I think that is kind of where I find penance to be still like a really meaningful part of my own spiritual life, is to say, in working on myself, I'm not beating myself up so that I can save the world or something, but I'm trying to think through the ways that unjust structures have like messed me up and how I can maybe try to create some different sorts of habits that put me back on the the path to liberation or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's the toxic sense of penance that you mentioned a minute ago, which evangelicalism is full of. You whatever, you do something bad, you make a weird deal with God, you're gonna read your Bible every day, and then God will forgive you or something, and that's like,
Right.
bad. There's also a very hollow sense of penance too that sometimes comes out in Christianity, where it's like, well, okay, you sinned, say 5 Hail Marys, and get on with your life or whatever, and that's not toxic. It's probably not even bad. It's probably not even that harmful if you think about it. But it's not the kind of thing that I guess we're talking about here. The sense where you're trying to actually like figure out what's going on with yourself and how to like sort of right the wrongs. The place in my life where I think this comes out the most is really just being a parent, which is very difficult. If you have kids out there, man, just really going through it. But I think it's such an interesting place to like actually really reflect on your own life and like what you're doing, because you think about like the ways that your parents may or may have not treated you, and then like you see yourself kind of recreating those those patterns with your own child, and you're like, wait a minute, hey, hang on, this is bad. And you have to like kind of like take steps to undo those things, and whether that looks like like self-discipline or something, or whatever. Maybe it's penance, maybe it's not the right word or something, but um anyways, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, though, right? We want to live in a world that's more just, that's more in line with the sense of justice we get out of the Bible, from God, from also from like other types of thinking about the world, like I don't know, Marxism, for example. It's great. But yeah, I mean, we have to be really mindful, I guess, of the ways that we ourselves are reproducing the world that we live in, and it's worth considering deeply that we are making a better world and not a worse one.
hmm Yeah, I mean, there are so many interesting ways to politically filter this term penance in this tradition as well when we tie it to justice. And I think it's cool to root it in that Aquinas quote, just to recognize that there is something that puts these things together, that penance has to do with justice. Um, the challenge, like there's probably a lot of cool political ways of reading the what happens when you go to confession and you talk to your priest and you do get an assignment, right? You got to go home and say the Hail Marys and so on and so forth. Like probably there's a lot of cool things to do about that. I don't know. I should probably think about it more, but I don't. But I think just thinking about penance in general is such an interesting theme. Like, I think about all these other sort of political issues like reparations or
Hmm.
what would it mean?
Or like carcerality, right?
Yeah,
Like that's like deeply. I mean, you can't even say the word penance without also referencing like
right.
the root of penitentiary, right? Like
For
it's all
sure.
tied together.
For sure. And so there's kind of maybe those dual aspects of the concept, or like Okay, this is a grad school poll, I guess, but Jacques Derrida, weird French philosopher that you may or may not have heard of, he had this interesting sort of concept of the pharmakon, this Greek term that comes up in Plato, where the pharmakon, from which we get the word pharmacy or pharmaceuticals and so on, it can be both the poison and the cure. And I see that a lot in a term like penance, right? It can be
Yeah,
both like the thing that leads you to the penitentiary, or it can be the kind of thing that leads you to thinking about reparations, or how would I kind of, what would I do in order to make right the things that I've made wrong through sinning, and how would I create a different kind of relationship? And reparations are one kind of material way of expressing, at least on a social kind of way, what that might look
yeah,
like.
yeah. You brought up Jacques Derrida. It's a grad school poll. Welcome to the Real Deconstruction podcast now. But I think that's right. I mean, someone like Derrida who can kind of notes those things about how penance is an idea that can flip into its opposite. It transfers from something helpful, reordering, to something that's like disordering, awful, bad for you. It reminds me, I guess, since we're on a kick already, it reminds me of this real particular way that these other French philosophers named Deleuze and Guattari talk about something really similar about the ordering of the body. And in their particular philosophy, it has a lot to do with like how do you come to desire the things that you do currently desire, and it's actually not all that different than the way we're talking about penance as it's connected to justice, right? Like, there's a handful of things in your life that you want for one reason or another. Not just like sexual desire or something, but the desire to live a certain life or to be a certain type of person. The deep feelings and like affects you get when you're going about your daily life. Like those are things that you desire. And in Deleuze and Guattari, though, they have this way of talking about it where it's like, that's great. You should think about those things. You should think about how you get those desires. How do you come to desire like wanting a certain type of political democracy, or how do people come to desire fascism? Right, these things. But also, they recognize too that like when you are doing like the internal work, when you're thinking through yourself, when you're thinking about why you want these things, and you're thinking about also like, well, what if you were a different type of person, or what if you were I don't know, what if you lived a different type of life? You can also like severely mess yourself up.
Right.
Like, they have a whole lot of very colorful language I don't actually want to repeat in this podcast to talk about it. It's all like really rooted in like sadomasochism and BDSM, which is wild. That's some wild postmodern philosophy for you. But I think the point still stands though, right? That there's a certain order that we have in our lives that produce desires that produce the type of persons that we are. When those things become wildly disordered, or they're never ordered in the first place, or whatever, however we want to think about that, we end up like wanting things that are bad, or reproducing things that are really unhealthy for us. So I don't know, I think of penance as at least one of those types of like spiritual technologies that you can use to like put things in place, and what should at least you hope to be a good way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that is a good way to talk about it. I mean, spiritual technologies, that is what I'm all about. There is, I don't know. Now we're just on a philosopher's kick, and I guess that,
Let's do it. I mean, it's our
welcome,
podcast. No one's stopping
yeah,
us.
that's right. Welcome to the post grad humanities seminar, I guess. Yeah, so there's another German philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk. He is kind of a reactionary and very annoying about a lot of things, but I read too much of him for my own good. And he does have this actually very interesting idea about religion being a set of technologies or things that we use to work on ourselves. He's like that. If you want to know what religions are, the best thing you could think of is kind of that. They're these practices that we engage in either consciously or unconsciously in order to change ourselves and then maybe change the world around us also. And it is really bizarre if you think about it, right? Why would you go to mass or any kind of church service? Why, let's take maybe a low church example, because mass is easy. Why would you go to like an evangelical worship service and stand up and listen to Hillsong songs for a few hours, and then sit and listen to a pastor stumble through like some commentaries for 40 minutes, and then go to coffee hour after, right? And even in those kind of low church situations, you're sort of coming into basically like a big greenhouse for producing certain kinds of human beings, and that's why you go. You want to be changed into a different kind of person. And what I like about penance is that there is this kind of intentionality that's involved in it. That for so much of our spiritual lives, all that technology is kind of in the background, or it's operating in, I don't know, kind of a subterranean way, and that's what makes it successful. And when it works well, that's actually good. You want it to kind of embed in your being, right? But penance is this moment where you take this kind of reflective, auto reflective relationship to yourself and start to say, well, could I sort of create some other habits here? Are there other technologies that I might want to grab, like the Hail Mary or something, in order to reorient myself? And I think in terms of the spiritual and personal meaning, at least, of penance, it's just like a nice moment where you kind of make explicit what is implicit in your life. And I like that a lot about penance.
Yeah, totally. I think that's the switch of the implicit becomes the explicit is a really good note. Thinking of it as a spiritual technology is really helpful because like I don't know, think about all the other technologies that you do use every day that are not like, explicitly spiritual or something. This is
Hmm.
I'm kind of like swapping out the connotation of technology in this sentence, but like think about all the other sort of like structures you kind of bring yourself under every day that do form who you are, right?
Hmm.
And you do it completely, at least I do. I don't know, maybe you people are out there really intentional about it. But like it's like, mostly unintentional. Like, I don't know, I'm laying on my couch and like looking at TikTok for like 30 minutes or whatever, which is which is exactly what I'm saying, right? It's bringing yourself under a type of discipline or practice that like probably does something to you in one way or the other, right? I'm not saying that like TikTok is somehow bad for your soul or whatever, and you should do penance for it. But what I'm saying is that like I don't know, think about the ways that you have to sort of bring yourself under the structures and discipline of your work or of your bank or of whatever. Um, and you only go to church one time a week, so it's like one clearly has a little more sway over your life. So it's worth really thinking through penance as a type of practice where you could maybe, I don't know, rein some of that in, or at least be introspective about some of that.
Yeah. Well, before we go to maybe like thinking through what some liberation theologians have to say about it, maybe we could break down a little bit further kind of the uses and abuses of penance. We've gestured toward it. It's the pharmacon, it's the it's the poison and cure, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, maybe we could just dig into it a little bit more. I think you're right, Matt, to point out that anytime you talk about penance on the left, you definitely are going to end up talking about the penitentiary. This is kind of, I guess, a bit like abolitionist history 101, but I always find it really important to tread that ground over again. So the penitentiary, as we know it, originates in Quaker ideas about how you should deal with people who are criminals, labeled criminals.
Mhm.
And the premise for the first penitentiaries set up by the Quakers in the United States was that if you were a criminal or a sinner, you would be locked away in solitary confinement, and you would have this opportunity to listen to the divine light inside of you. And you would do your penance on your own because you'd finally have this kind of moment alone with God. And then you would come out, a changed, converted person, feeling way better about your life. And guess what? It doesn't work that way, right? But there's this kind of whole theology behind the way that we've organized our punishment structures in the U.S. and then kind of also exported them around the world. And maybe helpful to pause at least and kind of think about the messed up ways that penance has shaped our social lives.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, the thing too about a penitentiary is like it's a reprieve, right? It's a moment. It's like you're not going to go away for 20 years in the Quaker sense. It's different. There's a
Hmm.
different vibe to it. Not saying that like it's good or something I would recommend or whatever, but still, it's a different vibe than the I don't know, the extreme disciplinary technology of like a jail or a prison or
Hmm.
something.
It's true. But the thing that kind of, I guess, persists is this Christian idea about the reforming part of it or the kind of redemptive part of it. And this is what is so messed up, I think, about carcerality in the United States, especially, and in Canada and elsewhere too. But there's this sort of idea that, on the one hand, if you go to jail, you're basically garbage, or like Angela Davis
Right.
says, prisons are the place where we put the detritus of society, right? It's like we're flushing people away. But at the same time, the way that we justify prisons to ourselves is to say that people are paying their debt to society, or they're going to a rehabilitation center or a correctional facility, right? The implication being that they'll be corrected, they'll be correct when they come out of it, and they are not, right? They're traumatized by those institutions. So it's this really kind of strange way in which even that logic of the penitentiary is still present today, that we tell ourselves prisons are necessary because we have this kind of comforting lie that they're going to make you a better person if you go through them.
Totally. And the myth is so bonkers though too, because like people will, will say it's rehabilitative or whatever. Or maybe they won't say that. But like, there's a sense in which even if you do the time, you still are not a whole person afterwards, right? Like even
Right.
politically speaking, like in
Right.
most states you can't even vote, which is, jacked up.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There's probably lots of other ways that we could kind of get independence. Like I often think about the kind of stuff you get in critical theory about Christianity and capitalism, the kind of subject that emerges in capitalism.
Right.
So, like, we've talked about this, I think, on the show a long time ago, but Herbert Marcuse, who was a German philosopher, he wrote this really interesting thing about Luther and Calvin in particular that I always think about, where they have this kind of break from the church, but what they end up doing is they move the big disciplinary structure from outside to the inside, and that is super convenient for capitalism because then you kind of run around policing yourself, so you can't point to the church out there as like the thing that you're pissed off about and you want to like rise up against and have a revolution against because you don't like the corrupt bishop who's out there or something. Instead, it's like the corrupt bishop is inside, and you can't really rise up against yourself. And so the idea is to constantly be like pacifying yourself into a better and better capitalist subject over and over again. And that is also maybe a weird way in which, like, I don't know. I think about that when I think about penance too. That there's something about at least the kind of sacramental tradition of penance that I like, because it does kind of externalize the relationship that you have to sin
Right.
and puts you in a relationship with somebody else over it. It can be bad, but it can also be very good. As opposed to my own experience in Protestantism, where it was like you're constantly doing penance and you can never ever actually like atone for what you're trying to sort out. And that is extremely good news for capitalism and very good news for, or very bad news for your psychological health.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know. That's the whole story of church camp, I guess, right? For evangelical kids is perfecting the awful voice in your head that never lets you be like an okay person or something.
Right.
Yeah, because Jesus died for you and here you are doing all kinds of gross stuff.
Right.
Yeah, it's bad. Well, let's pivot a little bit, right? So we have some of these themes on the table. There's penance in these like sort of bad ways, and when it comes to carcerality, when it comes to the overbearing self-policing sort of sense. I mean, we could talk about Foucault even, but let's not. We've already mentioned like four French philosophers. He's in the mix though, folks. Don't worry. If he's your fave, we said his name. It's cool. But there's all these like senses in which like penance and sort of like the internal disordering or feeling disordered inside, the ways that can be very toxic for you, right? There's also a sense in which it could be very good, if you kind of think about it in different terms, maybe in this Aquinas sense, the sense where it's like connected to justice in some bigger way. And when we really get into it, I think that like it kind of ends up being a sort of a matter of intensity too, right? Like how far are you willing to go to scrutinize yourself and like all this kind of stuff too. There's a lot going on here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But there's also a sense in which kind of taking stock of yourself, like I said earlier, like kind of figuring out like why you are the person that you are, or figuring out like where your good desires end and bad desires begin, or something, or if that's even possible. There's something to that, right? There's something about figuring out the order of things in your life, the order of importance of them, the order of like what you find really valuable, or what types of things you're willing to reproduce, and maybe what types of things you're willing not to. There is an interesting sort of liberation theology Jesuit who I'm sure Dean you could say a lot more about, named John Sabrino, who has some really interesting things to say about this in an essay he wrote called "Spirituality and Following Jesus." Um, Dean, do you want to say something about him?
He's great. He's great. He was a good Jesuit. He's still alive, actually. He wrote quite a lot of interesting stuff. He's from Barcelona, actually. I don't know. I'm gonna get on a tangent, but there's a really cool transmission of priests from Spain to Latin America who then get like really wild. And Sabrino is one of them, one of the cool Jesuits out there. He did get like disciplined by the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in I don't know, like the early 2000s or mid 2000s or something. But anyway, most of his work was in El Salvador. He was a cool guy. There you go. There you have it.
Thank you.
Great,
Fantastic.
great liberation theologian.
I'm gonna read a little piece of this here that will maybe help us like pivot from or make the connection between the individual towards like the societal or the structural, the social. It's a connection that needs to be made though, right? Right? Because I guess the point we want to bring out in this episode is that penance is something that is internal that you do yourself, but also it has like maybe some kind of political nature to it too that we can draw out here. So John Sabrino writes, peacemakers are those who have not made the battle itself their ultimate goal, gotten used to it, placed their whole trust in it, or transformed it into a mystique. Positively, they are those who, even in a time of struggle and conflict so inevitable in liberation, seek to humanize their conflicts, bring all other means as well to bear on ending them, and through the thick and thin, fostering the reconciliation to come with signs of reconciliation in the present. Those who can forgive are unwilling to close off the future for their adversary or their enemy. They toil for reconciliation in its personal form and in its structural forms, by dialogue, by negotiation, and they posit signs of the same, since without it, no triumph is lasting and no society humane. So this is John Sabrino kind of talking about, talking about these like key sort of Jesus-y types of virtues, like blessed are the peacemakers and whatnot. Um, but there's something really important here, I think, when it comes to like like our internal lives and our sort of ordering of ourselves internally when it comes to reconciliation. And I think it's worth drawing out here that, and I think it can help kind of make a connection from one to the other, right? So, like internally, he's saying if you're struggling for liberation, but the battle itself is not the ultimate goal, right? Fighting is not the whole thing. Um, instead the whole thing is seeking liberation, something after the battle, right? The conflict is fine, but the point is to overcome the conflict. um there's a certain sense of being there in the idea where you're not closed off to a future, right? Your internal life is ordered in such a way where there's a future that's possible for you that's not been foreclosed upon. You're not if your internal life is not oriented toward like fighting itself, that there's still a future after the fighting, that there's still a future after the struggle for liberation, and that's kind of the important piece of it here, I guess, because you get the sense in which your comportment towards the world, the way that you carry yourself into struggle, or into movements of liberation actually really matters. And that like internal ordering, um, if it's in line with justice, there's a future for you. There's a future that's not just fighting in a sort of hopeless moment.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I like that resonance between the personal and the structural. It makes me think about what I like the most about the practice of confession, which is I think anybody, when you do something bad, when you say something that you regret, or you do something you regret, or a kind of situation doesn't go the way you wanted it to, or it does go the way you wanted it to, and then you are kind of like, well, my conscience is telling me I shouldn't have wanted it to go that way at all. Right? These kind of feelings that like you can't really turn back time, but you know that there's something just off about that. I think it's hard to sort of walk around with them, and they can become really stifling, challenging, and they can feel like they're starting to foreclose a future on you. That, at least for me, anyway. Like I don't know, I have OCD, so maybe that's part of it too. But you end up having these kind of feelings, that create a big thick blanket that you can't get out of. And what's great about the idea of confession and penance as a sacrament in the church is you have a moment where you go and you talk with somebody else, and they kind of validate that, yeah, you feel that way, and it's not bizarre that you do. And at the end, they try to give you that future back to you, right? Through that act of forgiveness. And to kind of expand that out into a social reality, I think is really neat. And that sort of, how does he put it here, Sabrina? They posit signs of the same, right? Signs of that future to come, to sort of see even that little personal feeling of like having a future return to you as being a signal of like the eschatological future that we're all hopefully moving toward. I mean, that's one thing that I've always really valued in the sacrament is like when I feel lighter, then everything else feels like more possible in a way,
Yeah.
and just helpful to have that institutionalized, at least in the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I don't wanna do too much work here, like, diagnosing the left in general, because that's dangerous. But, like, I don't know, in some very online sections of the left, you see people do you see the disorderness of their lives or the disorderliness of, like, what people actually want, like, when people fixate too much on, like, revenge or, um, I don't know, like chopping people's heads off with like the guillotine or something.
Mhm.
It's like really I get it. Like there's sort of a catharsis there that makes sense, and like I get why that's like funny or like whatever. But on the other hand, like if that's what you're after, this is fundamentally bad, right? This is
Yeah.
not what you want. This is it forecloses a type of future that you could actually have in the world if that's really what you want in your sort of deepest your deepest heart, your heart of hearts, to be Guardian, I guess. Um, yeah, well, it's important. It's important to think those things through, and maybe it doesn't work out exactly the same for everybody. The types of desires you have in your own life, they're probably pretty unique or weird or uh, unique to you, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But it is good to think through, like, what kind of end do you like actually have in sort of your, in your conception of justice and how you think struggle actually works. Like, what does the end look like? And you can start kind of parsing out your your order. I don't know, I don't think I really like the word ordered or orderliness.
Yeah.
I think that's actually kind of problematic. But you know what I mean, though. I guess there's like a
Mhm.
sense in which like you can want things that are good or you can want things that like warp you inside, and
Mhm.
that's bad.
Right. No, I totally agree. I mean, I think that, well, there's that famous quote from Marx, when our term comes, that we'll make no excuse for the terror.
Yeah, did people
Um,
stop saying that though?
yeah. Well, it's like, I get it. I get it because Marx
Totally.
is writing in the context of, the crushing of the Paris Commune and all that kind of stuff. And it makes a lot of sense. He's surrounded by, the dead bodies of his friends and good revolutionaries and all this kind of stuff. I get it. But at the same time, my mind always goes to the Sandinistas, which is like, they chose a different path. They abolished the death penalty, right away and decided to do something different. And I mean, it's that revolutionary forgiveness that we talked about, maybe like a month or two ago. That there's a different way of, putting a society back together and a different way of dealing with those social sins or social traumas. And yeah, penance and reconciliation are all kind of bound up in that. It's like working on yourself even enough to understand that, like, even a justifiable rage or anguish, can kind of, suck you up from the inside and make you into somebody that you probably don't want to be.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's such a hard line because on the one hand, like, that type of rhetoric is important, right? It's important for people to really express themselves. It's important for people to like have a moment of catharsis, to be even hyperbolic, or even mean it, I guess.
Yeah.
But there is a certain sense in which like it goes kind of too far. Not like the saying it isn't the hard part. Saying it isn't the part that's necessarily bad, but like letting that type of like idea warp your insides so that you could actually never be happy, that you could never stop fighting or something. That's the bad part. Desiring it is really
Right.
bad. Saying it is
Right.
probably
Right.
okay.
Yeah, well, it's I don't know. We're just quoting a bunch of people tonight, but there's that, Brecht poem about, we, kind of, it's like to those who come after is one of the translated titles, but it's a really famous poem. You should go read all of it. It's all very good, but the gist of the poem is basically like, the sort of addressing people in the future who are living in a social society from the perspective of someone like Brecht, who is, in the 20th century, in the worst of it, trying to think it through. And the kind of thrust of the poem is to say we've been doing all this hard work, and like there's a line where he says something like, those of us who wanted to make the world pure could not ourselves be pure, or something like that,
Yeah.
right? Like there's this kind of recognition that the struggle will mess you up, and that is important to figure out as well, to attend to that and not just like write it off.
Yeah, totally. That's exactly right. People who like are formed in the revolution, I think, have a there's a sort of difficulty to figure out what comes next. To leave the mentality of war or something is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in all of this, what we're talking about, though, I guess, when it comes to penance and reconciliation and forgiveness and all these kinds of big ideas, it kind of comes down to a certain sense of sin, which is tough. We've never maybe we should have done an episode on sin. I didn't even think about it. But I guess this is kind of, I mean, implicitly about that in some different ways. Um, but when you are reorganizing your life, or when you're trying to think through some of these big topics like we're talking about here, I mean, guess that's primarily kind of like what you're thinking about, right? Sin is in penance, like we said at the top of the episode. You're seeking penance from sin. You're trying to get yourself away from these things that you've done that are wrong. And in a certain way, sin feels kind of like a immature type of language to use when it comes to some of this, because I don't know, maybe I'm just biased or something, but it seems like sin is such a it doesn't quite encapsulate all of like the weird ways, like the very passive ways that a capitalist political economy forces you to act towards other people. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think sin is right. Maybe sometimes people say structural sin or something like that, and I think that's pretty good too. Social sin, whatever. Social sin, I think, actually has weird anti LGBTQ stuff to it, so maybe not that one, but structural sin. Well, I'm going to read another quote from Victor Codina from an essay he wrote called "Sacraments." This actually comes from this big liberation theologian sort of reader. Dean, what's the name of the book called? Systematic something?
Systematic theology. Yeah, it's the same one we were reading from with the A Curia stuff
Yeah.
last time around.
It's kind of like the greatest hits of liberation theology. There's a lot of good stuff in this book.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm going to read this bit here quickly to kind of get into maybe the sin aspect of it and the reconciliation aspect of it a bit more. Some big ideas for sure, but I think it helps kind of draw some of this together. So Codina is he starts off here quoting Oscar Romero. Archbishop Romero's definition of sin is paradigmatic. Sin is what killed the Son of God and what kills the children of God. It follows that conversion must not only be personal, but also social, historical, and structural. Reconciliation with the church must be oriented to undoing the consequence of personal and social sin, to taking away the sin of the world, following the way of Jesus. That's in John 1:29, where that quote just actually comes from. In penance, the church prophetically announces God's mercy, denounces the sin of the world, and initiates its transformation by communicating the spirit of Jesus for the forgiveness of sins. So, I think this is actually a pretty helpful way of thinking about it. There's a lot of nuance to these things. When it comes from things that are, incredibly introspective and personal, but also, wide-ranging and structural and societal.
Hmm.
There's a lot of nuance to be lost, I think, for sure, in these kinds of quotes. But, I think that drawing those 2 things together, no matter how nuanced they are, is actually really helpful. Sin is the thing that kills that kills Jesus. It's the thing that kills all kinds of people, like we talked about last week. It doesn't just crucify Jesus; it crucifies all kinds of people, right? So that our conversion, it can't just be with ourselves. It can't just be a thing that we do. Our penance can't just be a sort of reordering of our own souls, our own internal lives, but it has to be something that's larger than that, structural, historical. He even says, which is pretty cool.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that helps maybe draw some of this out, right? Like, and not only can like our penance not just be personal, and our reconciliation not just be personal, it has to be structural, but it recognizes too that like the personal penance, the personal reconciliation you might need to do is also structural reconciliation that you might need to do, right? Like that you live in a world where you can't help but rely on the exploitation of labor of other people is something that is like a personal sin that we all kind of have to deal with in one way or the other. but it's also something that's happening historically, that's happening structurally. It's a bigger problem than just, as it appears in our life.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is what liberation theology is good at, is kind of drawing out these two things. Like Kadena summarizes it in this essay elsewhere, saying, what theology of liberation emphasizes is that neither sin nor reconciliation is purely intra ecclesial. Sin wounds the ecclesial body, but it possesses a dynamic of death that affects society and history, structures of sin. Sin kills the life of personal and ecclesial grace, and it also kills the brother or sister. And that kind of emphasis on understanding that the spiritual and material are not, neatly separated is, I think, really good. He goes on to say, in contrast, this new horizon of the kingdom must from time to time encourage the church as a community to seek the forgiveness of God and the world for its collective sins in the past, the colonial period, he puts in parentheses, and in the present, its alliance with the powerful. As servant of Yahweh, the church must bear the sin of the world, intercede for sinners, and anticipate liberation. And I think that is also a huge piece too, right? That like there's a collective kind of component to this. And I mean, I can't really help but think of just today when we're recording this is the day that Pope Francis made an apology for colonialism in Canada to a delegation of indigenous people in the Vatican. And watching some of the responses to that has been very interesting. Like, it pretty much everybody is like, it should have happened a long time ago. It's all too late. But like some people say it's a big weight off. Others are like, yeah, I want more and all this kind of stuff. But the biggest sort of issue, at least for me as a person observing it, is like, I don't know, what's going to be the material consequence of this? What's the penance that follows after the
Right.
confession? And that kind of piece that Kadena puts out here, that we have to seek forgiveness of both God and the world for our own sins, is a really important part of that as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, on that point, I think it's good to draw that out, Dean, right? Like what are the material consequences? What does the penance actually look like, following the Pope, making a statement? That's a good question. Um, James Cone actually asks something pretty similar in the book God of the Oppressed. And we're just kind of skipping from quote to quote today. That's fine. Whatever. Anyways, James Cone says this: there can be no reconciliation with God unless the hungry are fed, the sick are healed, and justice is given to the poor. The justified person is at once the sanctified person, one who knows that his or her freedoms is inseparable from the liberation of the weak and the helpless. Um, so I guess there's this that's it, right? Like that reconciliation, that doing the penance in your own life, both personally and structurally, it means doing something differently. And maybe that begins internally, introspectively, spiritually. Maybe it begins somewhere else, and you work your way a different direction. But I think either way, it does end up meaning, changing your actions, changing the patterns of exploitation in the world, and figuring out how to, ultimately liberate everyone. But that's the big picture, I suppose.
Exactly. I mean, I think too, everybody has to deal with this problem because we live in a world that is propped up by exploitation.
Right.
But, Christians have maybe a unique sort of piece of this in terms of trying to understand our own relationship to our spiritual life and to the idea that God is a liberator and so on. And it's kind of like, how would you reconcile with a God who is a liberator? Because God is basically pissed until there's no oppression, right? And that means that we're also, again, just caught up in those structural sins. And it's like, what does it mean for me as a settler Catholic in Canada to hear that the Pope made this apology, but also, the church has totally failed, like dropped the ball to raise money that it promised for indigenous communities? Like, what am I supposed to do with the fact that the church has a lot of property on unceded indigenous land? All these kinds of things, right? Like, what does the penance really amount to? What is reconciling both with the indigenous communities themselves and with like the God who is a liberator? What does that really look like? And I think it's important to kind of just allow the tension to exist between understanding that you personally cannot save the world, but also like you personally are wrapped up in these, complicated and frustrating ways in a world that is very deeply sinful.
Yeah, that's right. This is this all makes me think of something. I think this is in Amos, one of the prophets in the Old Testament. Amos is talking about like all these things that are going on in the world, right? There's all these people, they're political people, they take bribes, They exploit people, all these kinds of things. You take a straw tax on the poor, which is always the one I remember. I don't
Mhm.
even know what that really means, but people were doing it, and Amos was not pleased by it. But then there's this part later in Amos that's talking about what God wants is for wailing in the streets, right? That he wants God wants people out in the public squares to be like screaming and pissed off and like really annoyed and mad, right? And it's only
Mhm.
when that happens when God will start paying attention to people or paying attention to
Mhm.
suffering. And I think that that's a really important part of reconciliation and penance and like changing the actions of your life because like, are we actually it's such a maybe it's such a weird thing to think about though, but like we've become a people broadly speaking very passive to injustice, and like we live in a world where like it necessitates that some people go hungry, and it necessitates that people are exploited. It necessitates a whole lot of people like have to live a really awful life just to create like a sort of like luxurious situation for the very wealthy. And in at least Amos, God kind of demands people to wail, to be pissed off about it. And maybe there's
Mhm.
something to that, right? Like become unpassive to this world, to structure your inner life to really feel the struggles of other people or something.
Mhm.
I guess in the end, that seems like an important piece to me, though, where like you change your internal life so that you can't accept the external world in the way that it is
Mhm.
anymore.
Yeah, I think that is a good way to put it, right? Like, and that's also maybe what helps understand the purpose of penance, because it's like, I don't know. I interact with a lot of people who were very traumatized by evangelicalism in particular because of my, friend group and and history and so on. And I think that it's like we don't talk about penance very much, like those kinds of things, right? Because it's triggering and it makes complete sense to me, like why they don't need that, and it's just gonna make them upset and all that kind of stuff. But like, and not to, I'm not like being condescending by that, being like I know the deep truth and they don't, and they can't handle it or anything. It's
But
just
for real,
like,
though,
you
it's
know,
jacked up.
yeah,
It's bad.
yeah, it's messed up, exactly. And anyway, I think what I find useful though, or what has made me want to explore penance even in the midst of all that kind of messed up stuff, is that at the end of the day, I do think that done, with all the conditions being right, a rare situation, but one that does sometimes exist. The idea is that it should release you back into the world ready to do something, right? Like it should kind of lift the burden that you feel. It's not there to make you like dwell in your sin or make you kind of relive it or be traumatized by it, but on the contrary, it's meant to give you this kind of yeah, like I said earlier, this glimpse of kind of that eschatological feeling of being light on your feet and ready and capable. It's like it's a capacity giving sacrament in a way that I think is really transformative. So trying to see what are the fruits of that in a social sense, like that is maybe a key component to try to figure out if you're going to know that they're Christian by their fruits and so on. What is it like to be a person who has gone through a sacrament called reconciliation when you believe that God is a liberator? Like that is an interesting question to keep asking.
Okay, so at the end of the day, here, I guess here's where we're at. Penance is one of those tough and weird Christian virtues that I think we don't really know what to do with. And hopefully, after listening to us talk for 45 minutes, you maybe have some kind of idea, or at least a way to think about it. But at the end of the day, here, I think this podcast, what we're saying is that penance is a type of recognition that we are bound up in the structures of sin of the world. Internally, externally, all of it. We're deeply ingrained in it, and there's like that's just sort of like the nature of being a human person in the world right now. And while
Mhm.
like there's the big picture base and superstructure kind of thing going on, it's important to change that for sure. We gotta we gotta change it. We gotta seize the means of production. I'm here to say that. But we also have to recognize the ways that we are also perpetuating those structures of sin, like in our own lives, not in just in the ways that like we consume and we like are sucked into a capitalist system. There's like nothing we can really do about that. But also in the ways that we recreate bad types of relationships with other people, the ways that we reduce the humanity of other people, all kinds of things to consider, and the ways that we can work those things out for ourselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, maybe one way of sort of putting it too is like penance is a way of recognizing when you've been uncomradely and trying to make you have the tools so that you can be a better comrade, right? In one way or
that's
the
good.
other. Maybe that's the way I'm going to start thinking about it for the rest of the line.
Pretty good.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast, where you can join a Discord where there's all kinds of great pictures of dogs and cats. And just a lot going on in that Discord. A lot of recipes lately. It's a fun place to be. We do another podcast there every once in a while, a little less regularly today, but who knows? Maybe after Lent it'll change. Maybe if we get a good penance where we have to do more podcasts.
A penance where we can sleep a little bit more?
It
I
is
don't know,
about,
man. I'm tired.
yeah, exactly. It's about current events and goofs and jokes, and it's a fun podcast to do. Let's see. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro is by the Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have